Why does your mic sound so good now?
Well, because we've got a little upgrade going, right?
And you're lying down in like a Roman fainting couch, being fed grapes as you record.
Well, that's because, there's no desk up here and I'm holding it in my hand. Gotta find a comfortable position.
Just, I'm just imagining you like literally being fed grapes while someone fans you with like laurels or palms
Listen,
rather. You're
I
wearing the
mean,
laurels, you're being waved with the palms. There we go.
we're talking about exaltation and all that kind of nice stuff. So, there's also the benefits of being a Roman statesman, right?
Absolutely, especially for an astrologer. I have to say though, it is really nice to have you sound like you're not behind a window whispering to us. Because some of the like when I do the editing, I do have to boost your audio quite a bit. So it's been good to hear you more naturally. I'm very glad you upgraded your mic.
This one is definitely a much better fit than my prior microphones, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's such a better fit. You get to lie down on your side while you record.
Listen, a man is tired from many days of work and overtime,
But it all paid off, right? All funded the new microphone.
amongst many other things, yes.
Yeah, your servants to hold the fan, feed the grapes, arrange the gladiators.
I mean, listen, we don't like gladiator money. That's a bit pricey. And have you seen how much a ludus goes for nowadays?
Oh man, what's the going rate on a ludus? How many astrology readings do you have to do for people to get a someone in the arena?
That, well, I mean, I don't think I could handle it unless I got a very, very generous loan. But interest rates what they are, and the magistrates aren't too happy with me. It looks like I'm going to be losing my consulship soon. So,
You
if I'm
were
the consul and I can't afford one, who else
you,
can?
you are literally so mad that you're not someone's court astrologer.
Yeah, I'm so angry about it. I'm going to turn to Christianity. Call me Firmicus. Just remember, guys, just remember when the first amongst equals, the Emperor, is walking by, remember, astrology can't touch him. It can touch everything else, everything, but not the Emperor.
Yeah,
He alone is excluded.
can't quite tell you exactly, yeah, what this divination won't reveal what fish he's gonna eat, so you can poison it ahead of time. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge.
Exactly, exactly.
Be not alarmed at the frightful howls which you may hear. It's Sfinga, Salt, and Balkus Key. Who's Balkus? You chose this one, Salt.
He's a Byzantine astrologer from the East Roman Empire.
Okay, I hear
We have
Byzantine and I'm happy.
yep. Listen, everyone. She's an Orthodox girl. She's not like the rest.
I like how the I'm not like the other girls, I'm Orthodox thing stuck so well. Like people have messaged me many times with that line from the very first episode zero when we were chatting about starting the podcast. I'm glad it's had its tenure.
Mhm. One of the most enduring jokes on the entire show.
I think we've had many more enduring jokes at this point. I'm grateful to the people who really like whenever we bring up like hyperstitions with the jungle is
Oh my
massive
God,
quip.
yeah.
Jungle is massive.
Plenty more to come. Speaking of which, I'm really glad that we're in the 20s now of the podcast. It feels like just yesterday that we started. But look, we've come a long way. Salt's finally putting all those countless hours. I dare not name the number out loud in Crusader Kings 2 in order to mobilize as the Roman consulate he always was meant to be a part of.
Listen, I mean, if we're going to be talking about mapping out the stars, we should also map out the nations on Earth, right?
Map game forever.
Map game forever. I hate the map game, but I love it.
Yeah, your four digit number of hours played on Steam has indicated this to me very much.
As I have said many times, most of that is idle time. I definitely don't have time for it nowadays.
Listen, your new map game is star map game because you're looking at the stars.
Yep, that's right. And the struggle between the celestial kingdoms, and this star doesn't get along with this star. This star is very friendly with this one, probably a bit too friendly, actually. You know, all the fun things that astrology brings.
Well, we're going back to our roots with this episode because you're finally doing an astrology one. It took us, 22 episodes to get there, but we're here. Those of you who read the blog know well about his remarkable, prolific ability to talk about the subject in the most extreme detail. So I'm really excited to learn more from you about something that is essential. And for those of you who are supporting the podcast on patreon.com/ The Frightful Howls, you know that Salt does his almanac for the patrons, which is released the first of every month. Absolutely amazing work, right? You get to plan your whole month of sorcery and folk magic ahead of time with his amazing elections and various different tips and tricks and oral charms for considering everything that is positive and also not so fortunate in the sky over the course of the month. So for those of you interested in that, plus many other perks, including monthly bonus episodes, a Q&A that you as the patrons help curate, a monthly book club. This month we're actually doing Emma Wilby's Cunning Folk and Familiar Spirits at the end. And we also have, of course, our show notes and plenty of other perks. Make sure you also follow us on twitter.com/frightful howls to keep up to the show. And remember that even if you don't have the ability to support us on Patreon, we always welcome, and it means so much to us if you give us a rating and a review on iTunes, on Spotify, anywhere you get your podcasts. It really, really helps us defeat the demiurge of the algorithm, which hopefully with the assistance of Salt's amazing astrological insight, we'll be able to do even more readily so.
Well, I'm
And if
kind
you
of in a pro demiurge camp, so
That's because you always send me like the demiurge memes where he's just like, look at this beautiful world I created and you're all hating on it. I don't understand. And it's just like the images of like beautiful sunset and fields and like animals frolicking in the wild. It's just like they think this sucks. I don't get it.
listen, I'm just saying, man can see the ideas. Like he has a good comprehension of them.
I like that one
Uh,
Q&A we answered for one of our patrons that was just like, which philosopher should a cultist read? And like all three of us yelled into the mic, Plato. But also, speaking of which, one last little plug, we have services. You can always book an astrological reading with Salt. You can learn how to scry with B Key himself, get a private tutoring session with him, learn how to speak to the spirits that are around you and discover new ones. And you can hit me up for my Balkan Femimancy divinations, read the beans, and hear whatever you have to look into when it comes to your needs and your spirit courts. And with that said, Salt, I'm going to hand it off to you.
yeah, thank you. So I guess we'll give a quick rundown of what my astrology looks like because, it's important to define these kinds of things when we're talking about astrology, like terms like Hellenistic, Byzantine, Arabic astrology. They can offer a bit of insight into what a person's practice looks like and where they're coming from. And in my case, I did start off with Renaissance and pre-modern English astrology in particular, which I'm still quite fond of. I moved to medieval Latin and Arabic sources, but ultimately, I think like a lot of us, I ended up back in the Alexandrian and Hellenized astrology. And in particular, there's a bit of an emphasis on Ptolemy, as I'm someone who's interested in Aristotelian forms of astrology in particular. So Abin Mishar is also another big influence. Salvin Bisha, Valens, Dorotheus, and Rhetorius is also very, very influential, as we have them through the late and great Mr. Holden's translations and more recent excerpts from the very exciting Horo project. And these are all important influences, and I do blend these sources from time to time. I think purism to one astrologer or one source text is not only insufficient in terms of technique, but it's definitely not what astrologers were doing historically. No one just picked up Ptolemy and solely relied on him, nor should they. There's a reason we have texts meant to literally fill the gaps in his work.
Yeah, so similar to magic, right? In respect to just the sheer amount of influences that can coalesce within the very same discipline, as it were. It's all these individuals speaking across vast swaths of time as well as responding to each other. I mean, it's kind of like trying to take Thomas Aquinas and theology without taking into account the fact that he's always referring to the philosopher, right? But which he means Aristotle.
Yeah, and I mean, even the journey that astrology took to get to the West was very similar to that of magic, right? Because on one hand, you have this Hellenistic influence from the East Roman Empire, which is quite faint for a lot of history. And you have essentially during the early Middle Ages, not too much going on in the Latin speaking world, in the English Isles and so on. Like, there's not too much happening. And then you had the Reconquista, like in the 12th and 13th centuries, you have all these translations flooding in from the Arabic world, and it kind of just fills up European libraries with this new exciting science of divination that we knew about, we've kind of had, but not really to an extensive degree. And it just takes the world by storm. And in some ways, even the transmission of ritual magic had a kind of similar movement. We all know alchemy did as well. So it's kind of fascinating how, not just in terms of the way in which these things kind of coalesce, but also the way they've been transmitted is roughly similar, right?
Yeah, 100%. I know we always bring it back to the PGM. It just happens to be one particular group of texts that the three of us dabble with to various extents that we can speak about publicly because we have so many practices that we absolutely can't reveal in any shape or form or even hint at publicly. But that's one of those things that I really find I find especially appreciative of is just thinking about how the education of people who cobble together these papyri and use them as manuals of magic literally were able to not only be educated in various different disciplines, but were culturally already receiving the benefit of all these different streams that were already embedded within their worldview, right? So it's not just like studying different things, but like growing up in an environment which is all this was coalescing, much as we do now.
Yeah, I mean, historically, magicians were serious appropriators. They like what they see and they take what they see. And that has a lot of consequences, historically speaking. And I think the morality of this as a subject is also worth discussing another time when we're talking more contemporary habits. But looking at how magic has changed through history, there's Hellenization, Aristotelianization, Platonizing, Christianizing, all these kinds of appropriations and interpretations and adaptations. And astrology is no different in this. The Latin West being dependent on the Islamic world for astral knowledge, to actively becoming very hostile to Islamic and Arabic influence on astrology in the 15th and 16th centuries, despite owing an immense debt to the Arabic world. And even then, the knowledge we gleaned prior was mostly taken from the 13th century, the struggle between Castilians, Leonese, Aragonese, and the various Muslim kingdoms of Al-Andalus. It was not a peaceful transmission by any means.
No, I love hearing that though. Honestly, it's I think it's an important note to bring nowadays because of the exposure of social media. People are able to see pictures of shrines, pictures of workings, and so on that are uploaded all over the place, and so they inevitably get influenced, right? And there's also the discourses around what happens when some aspect of folk magic or some aspect of a kind of folk magic becomes now a generalized technique or a template that is used around the world, and what it means to pay both homage to these things not appropriate in the sense of like disrespecting the culture from which it comes from, but also to understand that like a part of sorcery, a part of magic that has historically always been the case is a need to use what works. Especially when you need magic to work for you, because it's not something that is purely a preference. It's a desire to keep yourself safe. It is a need to be financially and physically secure, right? When it comes to like a harsh world, especially when you're not necessarily in a privileged position. So I think it's something to keep in mind with these texts is like it's a nature of, especially with astrology, is to get things more accurate, you need to kind of borrow and use what is already working.
Exactly, yeah. Like there's a long-standing history of these texts. They've been filtered. Practitioners have input their own thoughts on each topic every single time. Like that's why we see so many changes. And I think as well, like the point about generalization is very important as you raised. Like, look at hoodoo, for example. I think hoodoo especially has become this kind of generalized approach to magic that quite often people will say, hey, I'm doing, English folk magic when you're doing hoodoo. Like,
They're
you've got
obviously
eyes to see.
doing, yeah, they're doing like you're not doing a kind of folk magic you would recognize in England among people who do folk magic. You would, or even historically in the early modern period, they're doing something that like very much looks like something out of a Lucky Mojo catalog, which is great. Like those things are amazing, and I do have some training in root work that I really, really cherish. Like I don't call myself a root worker by any means. I have a formal apprenticeship in that system, and I think that it's something that I'm very, very privileged to have been around a lot of people from, especially African American backgrounds, who are very well versed in root work and especially like southern United States conjure. But it's something that you see when people are starting to do like the candle like kind of layouts or certain kinds of like techniques that definitely like they kind of got off of the Lucky Mojo catalog. So and then they're passing it off as like this is like my culture's folk magic. Folk magic isn't just like a raw technique applied to like your culture, right? You have to always ask who is the folk? Like who are the people that you're referring to when you're talking about doing folk magic? Can you like do you know where some of the villages are in that country that practice this stuff? Like, do you know what some of the transmission lines are? And I think even with astrology, it's like, who are your lineage holders there? Like when you talk about like learning from Dorotheus and Abu Mashar and Valens and so on, like you're pointing to people who have essentially educated you, even though you didn't know them when they were alive. But certainly necromantically, they are speaking to you regardless of their texts. So I think it's good to not necessarily always like cite your sources in the sense of like a bibliography, but cite your influences, right? And that includes just acknowledging that someone came from somewhere, even if you're not necessarily given permission to name your mentor and expose who they are. It's nevertheless good to note where the training comes from so that it's understood that it is in a line of transmission, including if it's self-taught but through books.
Yeah, so whether or not, literary learning is a form of transmission or tradition, I think is another question, but like it's definitely a way by which one can come to terms with these practices. It's a way that one can access them. Like that's the thing with astrology, it is very much amenable to book learning. Most of my learning was just by reading source texts.
Hmm.
And it's important to kind of note, hey, these are the main influences, because at the end of the day, especially with your peers, who do the same kind of work, it's good to understand where the other person's coming from. Like when someone says, I'm not really a fan of Ptolemy and Abimishar. I'm not really a fan of the Aristotelian influence in astrology. Like I'm more of a Valence man, right? And it's like, good, okay, I'm getting a level that you're on. Like I'm getting an understanding of how you're approaching this, and I respect that. Like
Mm.
it's but yeah. So today's topic is on astrology. It's not so much on the transmission of astrology or appropriation of thought, although maybe it seems like it. But the main topic at hand really is the assessment of planetary condition. And I'm not going to talk in overly technical terms here, as I tend to do. At least I'm going to try not to. I want to introduce a subject and focus on the underlying rationale that makes looking at planetary conditions necessary in astrology, and also the implication of these assessments and where we want to apply them, because it's a subject that is often simplified in substantial measure. A lot of folks will look at the angularity aspects, house placement, and what are today called the essential dignities, and then they call it a day. That's maybe 75% of the fundamentals when it comes to planetary condition. So, for those who aren't fully versed, what is planetary condition? It's essentially one of the various underlying factors that inform every single judgment that you make as an astrologer. It's fairly common to say that Mars is debilitated, Mars is weak, or Mars is acting in the nature of a fortune. But we need to understand that these words have meaning. Planetary condition is not clear cut, it's not simple, despite being the most important skill in an astrologer's toolkit, or at least one of them. It's actually a maze of different approaches and understandings, hence why a technical overview can't just be given here in this episode. And I think as well, the fact that it is such a kind of quagmire of different approaches is exactly why, as we were just saying, noting your primary influences is important. And one of the things I think that is often missing from popular interpretations of planetary condition, and this is really where I want to start with, is contextualizing it. Planetary condition is contextual in the framing of the chart itself. It has a nuance to it. And we need to be careful in thinking that a planet who is maltreated can only produce harm, or a planet fortunate can only produce benefit to the circumstances that we're analyzing. Much like life, there's a kind of blending. A planet can produce success and honors in a man's career while also destroying his marriage simultaneously. It's not black and white.
Yeah, could I ask, what do you mean by the planet is maltreated?
So essentially, maltreated is kind of ironically, despite mentioning like the importance of specific terms, maltreated could refer either to a planet acting unfortunately or being weakened in some way. But essentially, it means that the planet is disrupted from carrying out its duties and obligations in an appropriate manner.
Hmm.
It is challenged in some respect, conducting itself in a manner we might see as problematic or unbeneficial, or it is, just not able to fulfill its duty and responsibilities.
Hmm. Gotcha.
So obviously, when I talk about nuance, that doesn't mean we need to consider like a debilitated or maltreated Mars as being beneficial. In most cases, he's probably going to cause a eruption of disease, violence, fights, plague, infestations. All those things that Mars loves to cause in our lives. But even the most miserable of souls have some virtue attached, whatever they may be. And at the end of the day, astrology is a divination method that does look at the entirety of our lives, the entire scope is human and even beyond human existence. So difficulty, turmoil, suffering, as well as their inverses of peace, contentedness, and satisfaction, all this is represented by the stars in astrology. So it does stand to reason that when we look at the principal causes of these things, that is the planets, there's a similar kind of nuance to it. So let's set an example, and we're going to cover the big topics that come into play here before breaking them down. So to return to Mars, when we're looking at a topic and we see Mars, who, as we noted, is a naturally malefic planet, he brings bloodshed, suffering, terror, diseases, tremors, discords of all kinds. He brings that beautiful fury and conquest, the father of Romulus and Remus, who birthed a city that would become for a brief time a microcosm of the whole ancient Mediterranean. So someone comes to us and asks regarding his nativity what matters the most pressing. We assess the figure and we find in the astrological figure the same star of Mars, fortunate, well placed, and how we actually determine this is, we'll discuss that shortly. But what I want to emphasize here is that Mars is doing good. He's got his destructive impulses tempered by means of good configuration, sect, and place. So how are we going to treat him here? He's still Mars. He's still going to produce these turmoils and chaos. That's his nature. It's just that these are going to be for the benefit of the one that Mars represents, or in the case of nativities, the native themselves, as well as for the benefit of those stars he has a helping relationship with. So if he was with Mercury, for example, and let's say that he has a stake in a native's career, he's likely rising in the 10th, ticking every box that Ptolemy asked for. We might think of gangsters, bandits, thieves, attaining substantial gain and profit by means we would associate with Mars. That is to say, robbery, pillaging. We see a fortunate star for the native. But what about the victims of the native? They're still coming out of this pretty bruised and battered without a doubt, especially if we've looked at the soul of the native already, and we can see this as someone who is militant, who is, for whatever reason, comfortable with violence. And we can build a picture here in this way. He might also be with Jupiter instead, and Mars and Jupiter tend to produce military officers. If Mars and Mercury are the underworld, the common man, and his use of violence, and Jupiter and Mars make for the monopoly of the state and the ruling classes over violence and the sanctioning of its use, i.e. the military, which for many, many states historically had overlap between the aristocracy and warrior classes. So you can see, right, there's a common theme. Mars retains his qualities and influences. If in this same circumstance, Mars and Jupiter were together, and he was ruler of profession, poorly placed, then he might even indicate the death of the native at war, or their arrest for deserting, or surrender and imprisonment as a POW. All kinds of shit. And I'm using Mars specifically because of how visceral his examples can get.
Mars is rough.
Like, he's crazy. It's why he's fun. But like,
this man crazy.
I mean, people really underestimate just how severe Mars and Saturn can be. Like,
The malefics.
yeah, I mean, they really do. Like, someone's got to represent death in the chart. Someone's got to represent suffering, right? And that's one of the roles that they play. And whitewashing them is really, really detracting from that, I feel. It's important. It doesn't mean you need to scream it from the roof. You don't need to berate your client with horrible news, right? But it is important to acknowledge this kind of role that they play. I mean, it's part of their divinity as celestial, celestial souls and the chief messengers of the gods they're so named for, right? It's part of their office. And whitewashing that is in many ways unpious, right? Because you're essentially turning your face from what is a divine expression, an unpleasant one for sure, at least in so much as human beings are going to distort those divine expressions. But yeah.
I really appreciate that point about the taking of even negative qualities of the being, or in this case, the star and the divinity it represents, as a point of piety. Just in terms of like how to actually frame the entire picture of the native, and how to actually, even in a sort of sorceress context, intersect with like how these divinations play out.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny actually, because we have a few examples of philosophers complaining about the way astrologers speak about the planets because they speak about them negatively. And they don't seem to have an issue that the stars are described as eliciting difficulty. It's more so just the language being used isn't necessarily how they want it to be used in reference to a deity, or specifically like the chief messengers of a deity. It's it's quite funny in that way. But yeah, I mean, it's, I think that's also one of the elements of astrology, right? As a spiritual practice, is this kind of acceptance, which is something that practitioners of magic in particular don't tend to be too fond of. But yeah, ultimately, I guess what I want to say is Mars is always going to be Mars. No matter if he's imitating the benefics for a moment, retaining his own nature as a malefic star, either way, his effects are going to manifest in a martial capacity. So where does condition come in? Well, like I said, right, the first example, the native succeeded. He plundered, he gained. The second example, he suffered losses. He had difficulties produced by the same configuration. And these were pretty simplified examples for the purpose of demonstration. Aries and Hermes, Aries and Zeus are not limited to just these expressions, just they're the most immediate and extreme that comes to mind. And honestly, because Mars is always entertaining, right? You can be a little bit exaggerated when we discuss it.
Yeah, I think that I have the same kind of problem with people whitewashing like monstrous entities in folklore or witches themselves in folklore as like misunderstood. Like, absolutely, they're maligned, but I think we don't want to strip away the actual destructive capacity of these spirits and beings, because, as you said, in the case of planets, as celestial beings, these are emanations of the divine, in most astrological theory, in terms of like how the worldview of astrology is understood. But also other kinds of folktales, like it's a sure way path to certainly get into a very dangerous situation. We'll put it that way.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's, are you really respecting God if you don't fear him?
Or even just understanding the destructive nature of things doesn't mean that they are bound to our morality or our present cultural understandings of aspects of danger and inclusion. I think these are things that are really important to consider when it comes to spirits, because if we too readily anthropomorphize them, and if we're too excited to kind of turn them into I don't know what term to use. Like I'm thinking of just kind of like when you make something and kind of like, oh, this poor misunderstood like being is secretly a patron of rebellion and so on. Like, well, maybe that could be an interpretation, but there's a lot of folklore that is built around how to avoid their ire, how to actually not get punished by them, how to not have your. We talked about that in the Super Incantation Bowl episode 9, right? About like Liliths, for example, like remarkable spirits, but ones that you need to be especially cautious around because there's a reason why the vast corpus of exorcisms from the Babylonian to the Syriac eras and so on are all about like preventing them from hurting women, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's, I mean, popular opinion isn't always correct, but in the case of the spiritual, like, especially when it's passed on kind of methods and techniques for preservation, like, they're taking that seriously.
Hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Well, I agree. Mars is a great one, but I think it's really helpful to kind of understand what you're discussing with planetary condition by using the image of Mars as kind of like a character. Like I like the way you describe Mars as like a soldier or a general and so on. These kinds of like nevertheless like anthropomorphized understandings to think about like the role that he's playing in a chart.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just helps in kind of translating astrological imagery, right, is to just make it personable without necessarily stating this is de facto the case, right? We
Hmm.
just have these examples which are imitations, portions of the whole truth.
Hmm.
So, like we're saying, and I want to move on to the second point here is Mars will always act like Mars, as we said. I mean, now he can produce things that are beneficial in a Mars way, he can produce things that are harmful in his own way. But because of his nature, even the benefits he produced might be what we would interpret as a little bit poisoned. Not, you know, not in a spiritual sense, but in the, I'm a human being, I don't really understand this, and this is uncomfortable. But that's the baseline. Pretty simple. But we also need to think about the context because who is he looking at? Who is looking at him? Who is he helping? Who is he hindering? Who is he in charge of? Who is in charge of him? And this is about relationships because these relationships are one of the most important areas where the context can change in astrology. Because we've kind of thought about the most basic level, right? The planet and its own nature. We've taken that into account. But we also want to think about the relationships that planet has with other stars. So we're going to run through a second example. We have this wonderful Mars in the 10th, great for his career. Whether it's as a criminal or whether it's as a soldier, whether it's just as a tradesman or metal worker, either way, we know it's good for his money, his wealth. But let's say Venus is in the ascendant. This is a configuration we call decimation or overcoming. When a planet, in this case Mars, is in a 10th house from another planet, or what we would call the right hand of the square aspect. And I like the word decimation. It sounds more suitable, the number 10 and everything, but probably use overcoming if you're doing consultations for people because decimation sounds a little bit threatening.
Like, what is being decimated?
Yeah,
It is
I've had
very
that. I've
Mars.
had someone ask me that before.
It is
Um,
indeed Mars doing Mars things.
yeah, I mean, and every planet can decimate. In the case of Jupiter and Venus, it's actually a good thing in some ways. Because you have like, this really nice and really wise guy come in and just be like, yeah, you're doing this wrong. I'm gonna fix all your shit, you idiot. But Saturn and Mars tends to be a little bit more gruesome. But yeah, in our example, we have Mars decimating Venus. So now we've got to think about context, right? Because Mars isn't being hurt here. So the things that Mars governs and rules, they're gonna be all right. But Venus is the things Venus indicates, the things that she rules, they're not going to be so fun. They're being damaged by an external source, by a martial source. So Venus in the ascendant can cover a lot of things. It can mean a soul is generally inclined to the arts, the poetry, the disposition of the native. If it's a man, maybe somewhat effeminate. The health will usually be pretty decent. Their appearance and temperament are also likely dominated by Venus. And again, we're simplifying to set a picture here, but now we have Mars striking our ascendant. It's striking Venus, throwing darts from on high. And all of the things that we just named, all the things that Venus governs in this figure, in respect to herself, her own activity, they weren't that troubled before. But now they're running into an issue. So what Venus is meant to govern was supposed to go well. But now Mars is here, and he's decided to tear that down. And in the context of judgment, this aspect, this looking upon, we take it as an external influence that brings danger or harm to the things, plural, that Venus indicates in the chart. This might be sudden disease, a disaster because she's in the first house she governs, the bodily form of the native. This might be corruption of the soul, inclination of impropriety in the romantic life of the native, because that's what happens when Venus and Mars tend to mix, usually. It might be harm to his mental health and soul, his career causing inability to express that creative need held by the native due to exhaustion or conflict with the employer, since, as we mentioned, Mars is to the star of and shower of the profession in this figure. And it could be all of the above. We would need to examine each of these topics individually to actually assess this is the case. But ultimately, we can see there is this idea of exterior or foreign influence, another person. And this isn't necessarily then the fault of Venus or the native themselves, but rather another agent or force, whether that is nature, events, or people. So we have the influence of aspects and zodiacal rulership coming into play here. This is inherently relationship based. And aspects are pretty easy. What we described above is an example of this, right? It's a right-handed square with a malefic. It's generally enough to cause injury. And similarly, an opposition with a malefic would tend to indicate the same kind of damage to the topics governed by Venus. Now, in the same way, if Venus was deficient and Jupiter was looking at her from the fifth, making a trine aspect to her, we could say that difficulties faced by Venus that result from herself were alleviated by Jupiter. You can see there's this kind of helping and hindering planets, as I tend to call them. And they're most often expressed by aspects. And this is one of the most important parts of delineating a planet's condition. Aspects are not predictive in and of themselves, save in very particular contexts, such as perfection. But they also don't necessarily indicate an innate deficiency or innate virtue. That it can lead to that by what we call reception, a pushing a power in nature. But yeah, to summarize, reception is when a planet is looking at another planet and one of them is in a domicile or exaltation, or other so-called essential dignities of the other planet.
Amazing. That's super helpful. I find that already I'm able to grasp it a lot more, especially because like a lot of my witchcraft and like magic is very stellar, but it doesn't mean that I do astrology, right? It means that I know folk techniques with approaching these particular spirits. But like this in terms of like how to understand the concept of these things. And actually I think it applies beyond astrology, right? It applies into also considering not just like electional astrology or natal astrology or horary, but also thinking about relationships between large powers. I think this is a really good way to consider that, especially when you're looking at folklore regarding to the stars.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. Like, on one hand, we have like natural sympathies and antipathies between the stars. And sometimes these can be circumvented by these relationships, right? Because the thing with the heavens is that in the traditional, I guess, for lack of a better word, model, cosmological model of the late Middle Ages to the pre-modern period, which was very much Aristotelian, but not always as much as we think. There's this idea of the cosmos as kind of cyclical and reoccurring, like everything that happens in the heavens specifically is bound to happen again and again, and that's how the heavens have an eternal nature. And in the case of hierarchy, as we're going to get into actually here, the hierarchy itself changes, yes, but it's also reoccurring, right? Because the stars will eventually all end up in the exact same place, the great year and all that. So reception actually relates to this as well. Because I wanted to discuss these zodiacal shares or portions, what we often call dignities, though I think the word share, as Dyke translates it from the Arabic, is considerably preferable, especially because it kind of gives off some of the context that we can use to understand their role a little better. Because it captures the kind of aristocratic almost rulership scheme that the heavens operate by. That for Platonists, for Aristotelians, for the Hermeticists, the chain of being also operates via, in a sense. There's a definite hierarchy amongst the heavens and the whole of creation. And the heavens being perpetually cyclical in nature, always in flux, yet always return to the starry thrones of dynamic hierarchy. Sometimes Mars is the ruler of Jupiter, sometimes Jupiter is the ruler of Mars. And yet they also have their own domains, their own fiefdoms. In Jupiter is found quiet prayer and sober happiness, not the distorted and perverted version that he's twisted into by those who think of him as an American hyper-capitalist that makes money and parties, but rather the dignified and authoritative power of virtue and self-restraint. The joy that leads from that, the emblem of temperance and balance, not limitless and aimless expansion. We only find that in his most corrupted expressions.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. It actually drives me crazy when people kind of go through Jupiterian sorcery or Jupiter as a planet or Jupiter as a deity and see it as like this very modern kind of Adam Smithian character, or even more than that, just kind of like this like for lack of a better term, like some like Wall Street Bets type character. Like there's nothing wrong necessarily with like, using magic on the stock market. I certainly Key and I have talked a lot about using gambling magic ourselves in various ways, whether it's with actual like money gambling or whether it's rare drops in video games. Key, what was it? What's the name of the mountain in World of Warcraft that you kept getting for your friends using like the what was it, the second pinnacle of Mercury?
Yeah, generated a bunch of invincibles out of running ICC.
Yeah, Invincible. There we go. Yeah, that plus like also some other things you've been doing. But yeah, it's just interesting when people seem to kind of push their personal like political desires onto these planets and spirits because it's like, oh well, like I'm personally, if someone is like a big fan of like a particular, economic system and then they feel like, well then gods of commerce and of wealth are all that's where we end. It's just the money and therefore it's just the current political system as opposed to just how I mean, even with Jupiter being an ascetic, like a guru, right? In plenty of different texts as well as like especially the Vedic context. I don't know. Not that I'm one to speak on those things, but it definitely just kind of strikes me as silly when they get so two-dimensional with it.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to talk about him as a wealth god, then human conceptions of wealth in the first place are going to be a trifling. Oh, I feel bad for human beings, they don't know how money works. And it's the same for politics, right? Like, what do we have that's going to compare to their divine knowledge? And yeah, I mean, I think Jupiter's one that's had a lot of influence in that regard. It's kind of like for the benefics, there's almost an inverse, right? Where the malefics tend to be whitewashed, the benefics tend to be romanticized in their kind of their most, I guess, less wonderful expressions, so to speak, in the ways where and it makes sense. I find actually interestingly that most people, the planet they get obsessed with tends to be the one they're most efficient in. It's kind of it's is that kind of a discrete way of the soul trying to nourish a innate lacking? Maybe, I don't know. That's a bit beyond what we're talking about here. But I do find that kind of interesting that as a trend, it does seem to be the case. And that might explain why these kind of perspectives come out into play. But who knows? I don't want to project anything there. It's just kind of wondering there. That might be a bit spicy.
No, I like it though. Let's go.
It's good
But
to it's a good thing to note even for people who may seek to, remediate that deficiency in some way. Like you were saying, it's kind of the soul crying out for the medicine that cultivating that relationship would provide. So it could be, to take the whole quality of the planet, good or bad, um, into the person. It's good to advocate.
Hmm.
no, for sure, yeah. I mean, there's just so much that goes into it, right? And I think as well, the philosophical system with which you approach it is also going to change how you perceive them, how you engage with them. I mean, if you even have one at all, like let's be real, the average like guy living in the city of London with one book on magic, that's all he's ever used, is probably not contemplating the higher purpose of the planets. But and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like they're here to help, they're here to nourish and support their charges, their creation, literally us, right? And but without a doubt, like I think you're right to characterize it as a kind of medicine. I think there's a lot of ways we can approach that, right? Because I know the Vedic approach to remediation has become very popular, as well as a kind of westernized version of that has become especially prominent in the current day. There's also the theurgical approach, right, which is expressed in a number of Platonic texts where by contemplation, by engagement with these celestial forces, you're kind of uplifted and attend to their chariots. So returning to the topic of the zodiacal shares, we can see that the planets have their natural domains. They rule over their material things, but amongst each other, they rule one another. So Mars can rule Jupiter and Jupiter can rule Mars, and we determine, as we all know, and this we determine, as we all know, by their place in the zodiacal signs. The moon rules Cancer, the sun rules Leo, Mercury rules Gemini and Virgo, Venus rules over Taurus and Libra, Mars rules over Aries and Scorpio, Jupiter over the Archer and Pisces, Saturn over the Sea Goat and Aquarius, opposite the luminaries. And these are the rulerships or domiciles. And so we say of Jupiter in Aries that he's ruled by Mars. We say of Mars in Pisces that he's ruled by Jupiter. And I don't want to beleaguer the point here. I'm sure most of the listeners here are aware of this, but even if you're well familiar, we're going to introduce you some ways of looking at it that you might not have considered prior. And I also want to emphasize that essential dignities are often the only thing used by people who are new to astrology to make their judgments. They're somewhat over prioritized in a way, so that folks will limit their judgments to angularity, or one of our next points, the zodiacal shares, and to aspects alone. I want to recommend against this approach because you will miss a lot when you do this, especially when we even ignore the rulers of a planet and the relation between them. And I don't just mean the domicile ruler here, but it's relatively common to do this. But we want to have a look at the full picture. We want to make sure that we get what we're looking for and we don't miss things that could change the entire reading, right? It could change the entire interpretation. So alongside this, because I want to challenge some misconceptions, I think it's also good to, for now, ditch the numbering schema. It's not necessarily the most helpful to count +5, +4, which was a later addition to this idea of the shares and the dignities. It doesn't really reflect the earlier perspective where rather than a degree of power or control, they reflected a kind of diversity in responsibility and role, different offices, so to speak. So following the domicile rulership, there are subdivisions of rulership. There are the domicile, yes, so we might liken that to the king. If we make the analogy of each zodiacal sign as a city-state, certainly the domicile lord is the tyrant, the king of the sign. He takes the nation in the direction he chooses, and it usually follows. Not always. Sometimes other planets do step in and move the affairs of state because they just happen to be there, or other times because they have equal or greater power, what Ptolemy calls his predominators over the topical indications, what the Arabic astrologers call the Almutans. And like we said before, right, the heavens are hierarchical, but its hierarchy is ever dynamic. But the domicile ruler, usually because of this broader influence, does tend to produce effects that relate to the outcome or the judgment. The most prominent example for our listeners who are probably familiar with it would be probably the judge in geomantic figures. So if we return to example 2, Venus is injured and harmed by Mars, but her domicile lord, to keep things simple, is unharmed, just a very able and content star. Disaster strikes, but Venus recovers. She comes out of it. She's actually all right. And so the native recovers. He comes out of it. Why? Because the domicile lord essentially fulfilled what his charge, his vassal, could not. He took responsibility for the subject, and what Venus was unable to achieve her aims, she suffered disaster. Mars prevented her from doing so. So the domicile lord stepped in. He came in and said, okay, I'll take care of this in the end. So you can see, right, this is what I mean by nuance, because on one hand, we have this absolute disruption of the initial thing, the ongoing events, but the resolution still works out in their favor. It's overcome, or some kind of other influence brings it to fulfillment.
I mean, it's just like relationships with people, right? Like sometimes something can be especially impeding, like some kind of force in your life is really difficult, or someone directly is causing a major kind of roadblock. And then outside of your power, some other force or some other friend comes through and resolves the issue, or like a superior in the situation resolves the issue. So I actually really love, I mentioned this before, but I really like the way you explain this because it makes a lot of sense to me to think about these as relationships.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's quite literally what they are as well. Like it's I think people have a negative reaction to the term hierarchy here, but like it is in a way a hierarchy because there are innate responsibilities. It's not one where it's a chauvinistic display of power over one another. It's a mutually nourishing relationship, right? And in this case, like rulers just have an obligation. That's why the concept of reception is so important, because if someone's in your house, you're not going to start screaming at him, right? Like you have a obligation to your guest, a duty. And the zodiacal shares a lot of the role that they play in prognostication relates to this kind of notion of duty and responsibility over particular things, which is why I like to compare it to a city state or a court, right? Because you have these different offices, these different stations, which attend to different matters for the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to clarify that this is supported by readings of the source text. This is not just me being inventive. So, for example, we have this quote taken from the Horoi Project's translation of Ali ibn Ishaq al-Yahudi from An Example of Nativities and Revolutions. So, in the show notes is also a link to his website, which is honestly a genuine must for anyone interested in traditional astrology. But this quote also illustrates the point we're making very strongly and explains a lot about how rulership was conceived in the early Middle Ages and also, in some respects, earlier. Just keep in mind that this doesn't mean rulership and attitudes towards it remain the same as astrology changed or even between different astrologers. But generally speaking, I would say this was probably the more common perspective.
We say that the events concerning the father naturally belong to the diurnal light, that is, the sun. But the events that later befall belong to the housemaster of the sun, his trigonal rulers, and the stars having rights over the sign in which he is in.
Yes, so this little passage here is talking about the zodiacal shares and the stars who rule over the share. So, like, let's say we have again Venus in the sign of Mars, right? So Venus would be the domicile ruler, house master, as it was translated here. We might have Jupiter, the Sun, and Saturn as his trigonal rulers, right? And these are the stars having rights. That is, the stars having a rulership or a stake, a responsibility to Venus in this case. And this is why it's important to look at things topically when conducting a more serious consultation. Because the decision maker, the judge, how can we deny him his say over the affair? If the natural significator, Venus, indicates the marriage, the domicile ruler indicates the outcomes of that. Why would we neglect that, right? And sometimes it's true, Venus will be more prominent, more powerful, and just have such a strong say that the king doesn't really have to do anything. But that isn't usually the case. That is not the norm. And we need to understand when and when it isn't. So that's why it's very, very crucial to look at rulerships. It's not the only reason, but this is one of the big ones. So I'm going to keep with the traditional order. After our domicile ruler, we also have to look at the exaltation lord, who has less responsibility than the king. He has less obligations, yet he still participates in the fruits of the nation. He receives the benefits without necessarily being obliged to perform for its behalf. He is, in a sense, the beneficiary, And this is reflected in traditional ruler skip schemes in a much more subtle manner. It's not really stated explicitly, but it's there. You will often look to the domicile, to the triplicity rulers to prognosticate a subject. It's very rare for the exaltation lord to be looked at in as much detail unless he makes himself relevant to the topic. And this is something that seems to fly under the radar in comparison to the others, but it's important. He has the power to make or break. If Venus in our prior example is struck by Mars and the domicile lord is busy elsewhere, it could be that it's the exaltation lord who comes in and rescues because he has responsibility. And if he's looking at it by a close aspect, the exaltation lord might well come in and interfere with the harmful rays being cast. Likewise, a planet in its own exaltation is usually described in very uplifting and positive terms with good reason. And we can consider it as essentially, like we're saying, like he's receiving the fruits of his own labor and he's going to look after himself because he's in a position to do so. And when another planet has that responsibility and a good relationship with a star, they're looking at him, they have a good aspect, then of course that's also going to contribute to ultimately fulfilling the promise indicated by it. And after exaltation rulers comes the trigonal or triplicity rulers, and these have been a subject of much attention in recent years. Chris Brennan and Benjamin Dykes have found some quite striking discoveries in their relation to the schema of planetary joys, especially. But the triplicity rulers were always crucial to prognostication all the way to the Middle Ages and early modern period. And like the aspects, they are generally seen as indicative of especially exterior or external influences on a topic. By the Middle Ages, we find comparisons to the good friends and allies of the planet who they ruled. We might also consider the language they use relating to themes of nourishment and wind in particular. The triplicity rulers of a star, and we're using the plural here because there's always more than one, tend to be the ones that support and sustain, not just on the odd occasion, but consistently and reliably. They provide for in a very deep and tangible way. And when that provision is challenged, when they aren't able to fulfill that kind of role, then things go wrong. Just as someone who was never given the resources or support to pursue a professional career, for example, is probably going to struggle, take time, even if they themselves are actively capable as such, because nothing occurs in a vacuum. Astrology makes this clear with the ever-growing web of relationships between the stars that frankly can get overwhelming at times. But ultimately, nothing is fulfilled without a notion of external aid and help, kind of concept of community, right? And the triplicity rulers tend to take charge on that wind, much as the warm east wind stirs good crops to harvest, while the frigid and turbulent north wind batters them with storms.
It's a really beautiful description, and I think it really is illuminating. It's kind of like with looking at conjunctions or squares, right? Like the idea that like if you're at a big banquet, who do you want next to you? This is often I've heard this expressed by multiple astrologers in my life. It's just like, well, you want to keep your best friends, your advisors immediately close to you, and then who do you want? In a place where you can see them, but you're not friendly with them, right? They're kind of like your enemies, but you still want to keep track of them. Like you want them kind of like away from you, but still visible. They're like square, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, the triplicity rulers, you're hoping they're going to be your friends, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're like the people that you're hoping will back you up in your moment of need.
Yeah, exactly. Do they always? Not necessarily. Sometimes they're too busy with their own troubles. This is one thing that you're also going to see with rulerships is sometimes a planet who should be helping you isn't able to. They're not necessarily trying to avoid their duty. It's more like he just doesn't have it in him, man. He's knocked out. The next one is the bounds and the confines, as they're called. And these are like the exaltation rulers, a bit underemphasized by contemporary astrologers. Not all of them, but they are mysterious for sure. We don't know their underlying rationale as far as the division. And there has been many a schizophrenic posting hour where I've messaged Key at 3 a.m. to tell him I think I figured it out, and then 5 minutes later, no, never mind. But I think every astrologer has tried multiple times in a kind of manic fit to just try and be like, what's the rationale behind them? I need to figure this out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we know they were extant in the Babylonian period. It's a very, very long-lived technique, which it's funny because they are also probably the most important or one of the most important considerations when we're judging lifespan, for example. But their use in these chronocrator techniques in releasing primary directions and so on can also illustrate the role that they play in general delineation to make for the environment and beyond that activity that is ongoing or occurring at a particular time. For example, what is happening now? If the planet itself is the person indicated, right? The domicile ruler is the outcome, the exaltation ruler is a source of strength or benefit, or even a beneficiary of these things. And if the trigonal ruler is the support and nourishment, then the bound ruler is kind of what is happening, what is taking place, where is it taking place, and also what is the speed of what is occurring. And that's why we look at it when we consider temperament, for example. Valens, Abu Mashar, both of them consider the bound relevant to these judgments, and with good reason. A man born in a cold climate has a temperament suitable for a cold climate. He'll be uncomfortable in heat, and vice versa. And the same kind of theme can be found in the bounds. There's an immediacy, a locality to it. And this can be reflected in ongoing events, actions. The immediate is how I characterize the bound, really. And to keep the city-state analogy going, then we have our king in the domicile, we have our vizier in the exaltation, we have our courtiers reflected in the triplicity. But in the bounds, we find no singular individual and rather just the hustle and bustle of the heavenly city's court itself. Finally, we also have deacon rulership, and this one is popular today. It wasn't actually counted amongst the early Ptolemaic predominations, but became so, and rightfully so, in my opinion. The deacons are often tied with physical appearance, with physical form, visage, very viscerally. To look at the appearance, it is necessary to also consider the deacon ruler of the ascendant degree. And this is why we see them so often related to sickness, to disease, and magical lists of eschewing sickness. We see the deacons mentioned and the maladies that can arise from them or be solved by them become prominent. And there's always a theme of material bodies and physicality to the deacons. And of course, we're ironically talking about the non-physical deacons, the divisions of the zodiac rather than the fixed stars rising and setting over Alexandria. So to set an example, Salvin Bishop talks about the use of the deacons in judging the appearance of the native and the influence it can have on their complexion. Not something we necessarily need to do today, but interesting nonetheless. And either way, we can see that the very explicit physicality and corporality, the material substance of a thing, is indicated by them. So, for example, Venus. Venus indicates a woman, right? And let's say her deacon order was Saturn. Well, it's a woman who has Saturnine appearance, Saturnian qualities to her. Appearance, maybe her age, that kind of thing. That's how the deacons play a part in prognostication, right? So this is why they're so valuable. This is massive information, right? Like what are you going to do when you're trying to find out who stole your MacBook, right? Something happened to someone I know at work recently. MacBook got stolen.
Mm.
And if you wanted to know, right, who did that, in this case, we do actually know, but hypothetically, let's say we didn't, and we wanted to investigate that. Well, the deacon's going to be very helpful, right, of whoever the significator of the thief is. Like, this is why it's important. This is why we want to kind of look at all these things, and this might not sound like planetary condition, right? It's like it's not good, it's not bad, but it does relate to the things that the planet reflects. It relates to the way it expresses itself, and that's really key here. Of course, a planet can also inhabit its own shares, its own portion of the zodiac, in which case it receives responsibility for itself. Venus in her own deacon and the ascendant, a person's going to look very Venus-like, probably be attracted by conventional standards, especially if the rest of the chart was supportive of that. In the same sense, if Venus was in her own bound, then it's going to indicate the engagement with the activities of Venus, the arts, the creative pursuits, the love of beauty in a platonic sense, and they'll thrive for it. And these things will produce happy things for them. If the triplicity rulers were well composed for the ascendant and the star inhabiting it, then we know that his body, his form, his soul, and well-being are also going to be nurtured. They'll have what they need. And if it was on its own, i.e., its own triplicity, then for the period of rulership that the star had for itself, it will support himself, but in a more positive sense than the isolation we might normally associate with that kind of language, i.e., someone who is truly independent in a very content context. And in both the case of exaltation, inhabiting its own domicile is just a sense of receiving the lion's shares of the spoils and the sense of rulership, sovereignty over the self that is applied for one's own self-interest. So, in other words, to humanize things, it produces amenable outcomes and ends in these ways, generally speaking. And hopefully we can understand how to break down the zodiacal shares and their responsibility then can shape how a star is going to act and behave, and why it's so important when we look at them and we want to make a complete judgment on the so-called condition of the star, because what is condition looking at? It's looking at the way the star is going to express itself and its influence.
This whole scheme, as you've laid it out to me, actually reminds me so much of like how I employ different spirits in my court in magic. Like when I sit down with them and I look at the opposing forces in terms of like what are the various factors that could potentially slow down or completely impede the result of the sorcery I want to enact into the world. Who are the spirits in my court that volunteer actively to take up arms against this problem? Who are the ones that want to support these spirits? Who feels like this is not particularly their best, like what they're best suited to do, and they'll like kind of solidify the fort. Obviously the spirits of the door and the crossroads and the land that like let the magic like leave where I'm working it to enter into the world, and like who can kind of lubricate that way forward and so on. Like the relationships between all these beings and the way that I negotiate pacts with them, because like they're all already there for me very much. So, and they're all usually very eager to work for these matters. So it's the strategizing war room element of it when we kind of like divine and talk to each other and figure out payments and offerings and so on, as well as like divination to see what the outcome will be and how I can tailor it to be even more successful. I love the way that like as you're describing, when you consider the decans, when you consider the various portions of the zodiac, that the rulerships of those very same slices of the sky, if you will, as well as the bounds and so on. Like, like all these things relate very much to what it's like to actually plan things with spirits, because that's what you're doing here.
Yeah, I mean, exactly right. Like, this is quite literally the heavens are kind of on a set course, right? This has all been planned along, like, since I guess the stars came into being in a maybe not literal sense, but certainly in a spiritual one. And I think that's kind of one of the big elements here is like this interrelationship, this kind of because what is a zodiac sign in terms of the dignities as they're called, or like the zodiacal shares? It's a division of labor. It's responsibilities. It's different roles and offices that are held. And like you're saying, like when it comes to spirits and their relationships with us, there's also that kind of relationship, right? Because some spirits are subordinate, some are superiors, some are specialists in certain things. They might be, like we're talking about thieves, maybe they're very good at finding thieves and telling you about them. Maybe others are not so good at that. Maybe they're not really the best at finding things out, but if you need something to go bonk on the head, well, he's your man. Like
Go
it's
bonk,
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 bonk key.
bonk key. Yes. My original name, by the way, that I suggested for this episode was bonk hits every time we mention Aristotle key.
Listen, you can't you after like the 8th century, it's hard to talk about astrology without also talking about Aristotle, man. I mean, even before that, he was very influential, but
The goat.
yeah, the GOAT. I still think Plato was better, but can't not love the man as well.
They're both goats.
No, I think they're bipedal chickens.
Oh, hell yeah. Behold the
Anyway,
man.
yeah, this is a pretty simplified breakdown of zodiacal shares. I promise it is simplified, and I do apologize if this did get a bit technical. I didn't introduce these terms fully because, frankly, there is a time limit. But yeah, I'd also recommend investigating them if you aren't already familiar with the concept. It's one of the building blocks of astrology in general, and you know, good to focus on the foundations to start with. But yeah, we can see how they kind of act similarly to aspects as external influences, yet sometimes something more than that. They aren't the be all and end all either, because in addition to these topics, we also need to consider fortune and strength respectively. And these are probably two of the most common ways of dividing planetary condition amongst the astrologers out there today. So, what is strength? It's capability, yeah. It's the power to do something, to act, yes. In astrology, this can also refer to prominence or the importance of an act or signification. That is how much impact, how serious something is. The main way we determine this strength is by angularity, and we can get into whole sign, quadrant houses, advancing, retreating, and so on at other times. Right now, we just want to think about angularity, the angular houses, the cadent houses, the following or succeeding houses. These are historically the principal way by which we judge planetary strength. If Mars indicated injury, disease for the native, we'd say he was unfortunate in his signification. Strength has little to do with fortune or unfortunate natures. But if Mars was strong, if he was powerful, then this disease will have more impact. It might cripple the native, it might make him lame. And astrology, unfortunately, does show this kind of thing. Whether you want to see it or not, whether you should mention it is more a case of ethics than technicality. But yes, if Mars is strong and happen to indicate these things, such as by striking the ascendant ruler, occupying the sixth house, where we find his rejoicing sign, or if he was simply angular and with a lot of fortune, these are examples where Mars is strong, he's active, and the issues he causes will be prominent. This does not mean prominent in the sense of visible. It doesn't mean everyone around you can see it or fame. It can be a hidden disease. You don't even know. Maybe you don't catch it till it's too late. It can be an invisible sickness that destroys the body, but onlookers around you don't know about it. I think sufferers of chronic pain tend to get this one. That kind of thing, the visibility is more about whether he's under the horizon, under the beams of the sun. But when we talk about prominence here, we mean it in a sense that it has great importance in our life, regardless of visibility in the most literal meaning. On the other hand, if he was really, really fucking nasty in a chart, like a real bastard, he was also weak, say in the third house, not looking at his ruler, odds are it's not going to be that troubling. It's going to be a nuisance, but it's not going to dominate your life. It's not going to be a very prominent thing in your daily living that kind of leaves a mark on you. So this idea of strength really refers to the level of activity, the level of engagement, the work he's putting in, so to speak, and the magnitude of these effects. Now, the way we determine this is usually by the angularity of the stars. The first house, the 10th, the 7th, the 4th being angular, strong, prominent. The 2nd, the 11th, the 8th, the 5th, the following the angle, the succeeding houses, they're pretty much middle of the road. And cadency are the falling houses in the 12th, the 9th, the 6th, and the 3rd. We find weakness, passivity, and action, and quietness. It's no mistake that the unfortunate and troubled houses and the houses of religion and contemplation are cadent, where the mind is drawn to higher things or bogged down by suffering. Also no mistake that the house of wealth and terror, of material happiness and success, so evidently important but also fleeting, should hold the succeedant. And as life-defining moments, the family, the marriage, the profession, and the ruler, as well as one's own self, should hold the angles. Of course, we also want to account for planetary joys. Mars in the 6th, Saturn in the 12th, Venus in the 5th, Jupiter in the 11th, Mercury in the 1st, and the Sun and Moon in the 9th and 3rd, respectively. Because Mars in the 6th is not weak, despite it being a cadent place. Saturn in the 12th is not weak. They're in their joy, as they're called. They're powerful, they're strong, and they're a massive fucking headache. That's the most important kind of technique usually for measuring the strength of a planet, is to look at the houses and to a degree the joys. But there are also other influences, namely the solar phases of the star, but that also relates to fortune, which we're now going to come up to.
That's the part that everyone's like, okay, we've talked about the sufferers. Let's hear about the fortune now.
I was just going to say, I think there's something of a joke to be made there with the great year and the inevitability of a planet to return to where it once was in a grand cycle, that we must imagine the planet's happy.
Oh no. Okay, Patreon bonus. We read Camus' like birth chart.
Massive.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the interesting consequences of astrology being as old as it is. It's kind of just lived through a lot of turbulent times, right?
Mhm.
Even the period in which it originated, like the Daidoji warlords, for example. It's got its recognition of things that aren't necessarily so pleasant. And I think that puts a lot of people off. I think some people are even a little bit perturbed by the notion that a divination method can include so many troubles, but it does also include like all the really beautiful and wonderful things in life. It's, I tend to talk about sometimes the more difficult aspects because I find them a bit more, I guess, immediately interesting. And I think listeners generally find those examples more interesting as well. actually. It's a bit more engaging, right? But it's important to kind of emphasize, like, jokes about suffering aside, astrology is something that does encapsulate the whole experience. And itself, like we were talking about earlier, right? Like, there's even when we do talk about trials and challenges, there's a kind of beauty in facing that, a kind of piety and acknowledging and how one considers that pious, whether it's accepting it, whether it's seeking the divine light of intellect and not be kind of infetted by those influences, whichever way you want to swing it. I think it's, I think that's one of the kind of really beautiful things about astrology.
Absolutely. I think it's a beautiful thing about magic too, right? The idea that like you may have been dealt a certain lot, but like you can pack with the spirits directly and transcend that in many ways. Like you can actively recognize what's there through divination to understand what your kind of inherent limits are and where you feel that there are certain roadblocks, and then gress them in many ways through, carefully cultivated relationships and very like sagaciously applied sorcery.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's, yeah, the interrelationship and like the way in which there's very common themes and also sometimes very distinct, because I know astrology can sometimes be a lot more fatalistic, but it is uh it is kind of a fascinating way of seeing the world, I guess you could say.
Hmm.
So I guess now it would be time to bring up fortune. Fortune. That's a term you'll see a lot in the context of astrology. This planet is a fortune, this planet is an infortune. This planet is an infortune acting in the nature of a fortune. Basically, the term fortune, exclusively in the context of planetary condition, also refers to, is this planet being a bastard? Because fortune is a little bit more complicated to judge than strength. We might choose to relate the state of fortune to indicate encouragement of flourishing, in happiness, and temperate gain. A planet cannot be too fortunate in that sense. It cannot be so good that it makes things ill. That's just a strong planet with excess accompanying its unfortunate significations. So when we want to look at the fortunation of the planets, we need to consider a lot of factors, and strength was pretty clear cut, pretty simple, fortune less so. And of course, the first of these would be the nature of the planet itself. Jupiter and Venus, the benefic stars, are naturally fortunate in their actions and nature. Mars and Saturn are naturally challenging and unfortunate. And in Aristotelian terms, this is because the first two are temperate, the second two are excessive in nature. Whilst Mercury is kind of interchangeable based on who he's with or his solar phase, or frankly, whatever the fuck it feels like. But these stars can sometimes act in the nature of their contraries. This does not mean that they themselves become malefics. Jupiter is never a malefic star in the same sense that Mars is. There's just as we mentioned earlier, Mars always brings bloodshed. He always brings turmoil, even if he was fortunate for the native. And in the same sense, Jupiter will always reflect an innate goodness, a kind of charitable and religious driving of the soul, even if that results in disaster or originates from a less pleasant intention. At the most basic and fundamental level for the Hellenistic, Byzantine, Persian, and Arabic astrologers, fortunation was mostly determined by sect. And I say mostly here because sect alone isn't really enough to make a judgment. But it is the most influential and most immediately important. The sect of the chart being, nocturnal charts, making nocturnal planets more fortunate, and the contrary to this as well. The notion of sect is divided into the diurnal and nocturnal nature of the figure, as well as the halves and congruency with the sign inhabited by a particular planet, whether these agree with its sect or its faction. And alongside the doctrine of sect also stands the gender of the stars, and if it agrees with their placement, and also their temperament. And these three factors are kind of crucial to judging the fortunation of a star, with the zodiacal share in habits and the solar phase also kind of having a stake in whether this planet is fortunate or unfortunate in its activity. Quite often as well, we will see aspects introduced to this dichotomy of fortune and misfortune. And definitely that is the case, but I also feel that they're a bit more externalized than these particular concepts. So personally, I tend to separate them, but it is true that in terms of raw fortune or misfortune indicated by the star, they do have kind of a say in it.
Hmm.
It's just that the details of how that transpires varies based on what it is, right? Like if it's an aspect, the nature of the misfortune is external. If it's sect, for example, the planet isn't comfortable. It's not satisfied in its environment, so it becomes a bit aggy. He's a big guy.
It's a big man. It's a big guy for you. It's our first Bane post of the podcast.
Man, that's should have been way earlier. What are we
Yeah,
doing?
literally, especially with Key on board. What were we doing? This should have been earlier.
It's a bit late in the podcast for you.
For you.
Oh man. Yeah, so I guess returning to the topic at hand, in respect to the malefic stars, they generally tend to fortunate qualities when their intrinsic excesses are tempered, when they're restrained, limited, and opposed, actually. You can think of Mars, right? Fiery, heated, agitated. You cool him down, moisten him a little, place him in a sign where his natural agitation is restrained, and compliant with orchestrating good works, at least for some. Likewise with Saturn, frigid, icy, cold, diminishing, and withering. When the hot blood refreshes and nourishes him, bringing some warmth that cold-hearted nature, we find his natural malice, envy, and grudge-born attitudes become somewhat gentler to produce more gainful labour. The benefic stars, on the other hand, prefer reinforcement to be encouraged in their nature to promote their innate goodness and charitas. Such that the hot and moist Jupiter, whose nature is temperance, when we increase temperance, we find no excess and only further harmonization. In the case of Venus, she's a star perhaps prone to excess when unfortunate to lose in luxury and hedonism, yet when favourable and encouraged to be such, there is a delight that pacifies and calms. And in this way, we find that the fortunation of the planets is of immense importance. It's perhaps one of the most crucial things to consider in any proper judgment. So looking at the fortunation of stars is one of the trickier things in theory, but in practice tends to be more or less simple, despite the moving parts at play, once you've got the swing of things.
Totally, yeah. It definitely seems that way.
Yeah, like there's a lot to go on, but it's all pretty easy to figure out. Like fortunation is one of the things that you'll pick up on pretty quickly when you starting off as an astrologer. Like it just kind of things just kind of click pretty quickly.
Hmm. Especially because it's one of the first things you assess, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like I mean, you can take a look at a chart and figure out if a planet's fortunate within a few seconds. Sometimes, like, maybe a minute or two, but
Hmm.
it doesn't take too long to kind of make that kind of judgment, especially once you've done it a few times. Like everything just kind of falls into place.
Right.
Another thing to keep in mind is the role of the solar phases in zodiacal shares. We actually already discussed the solar phases in a bit of a indirect way when we talk about planetary temperament, because you don't have it's not as in modern astrology where is this planet in a fiery sign or a watery sign. It's quite explicitly based on the position of the star relative to the sun that we infer its temperament, with a number of secondary factors influencing this kind of basic foundational assumption, as we find in Abu Mashar, who names the sign, the bound, the apogee and perigee, mixtures with other planets, and so on. But always, always, always the solar phase. And we've written about this a little bit in some of the recent almanac issues, actually. But this is kind of a topic for another day. So we'll leave it off there for the phases in particular.
God, your almanacs are so great. Not to excessively advertise or anything like that, but like I use them every month, and there's so many people that like are subscribed to our Patreon that are like, this alone is worth the cost, but like it's seriously helped them structure like the way different ways in which they plan out their ritual month.
Honestly, it makes me really happy to hear that. That was kind of one of the main things I wanted because, for myself, I need a bit of a kick, and sometimes like time in particular, like a very solid and defined time frame is one of the kicks I need. So
No.
writing it out is helping me, right? Because even as an astrologer, I don't necessarily have a perfect itinerary, or at least I didn't until I started writing it. Like maybe some months, but you miss a few every now and then. Whereas this way, it kind of just helped myself, even just concentrating on writing out what's coming up. And it's honestly really rewarding to share that and seeing people respond so positively to it.
Totally, yeah.
So, yeah, honestly, we've looked at the innate or natural significations of the stars. We have their aspects, rulerships, relationships. We have their strength, their fortunation. And these are really kind of the foundational components when it comes to judging planetary condition. I summarized it here pretty briefly. There's so much more. I want to rant about the 12 parts, about the anti-seer. I want to rant about aversion and non-rulership, where a planet isn't actually the ruler of something it should be ruling. But, we do have a time limit. And this was probably a bit ambitious for a podcast episode.
But very welcome, especially considering that it's been long overdue to have an astrology-based episode, and this is a really important part of the scheme as you've laid it out.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of surprising we went 22 episodes without an astrology episode.
But hopefully more to come.
Oh yeah, more to come, definitely.
Because I think these
The
bite-sized kinds of introductions to important topics are going to be really helpful for a lot of people who are learning astrology themselves.
Yeah, that's the hope, right? Like that's the ideal. It's kind of, a lot of this is stuff that I had to wrestle with when I was starting out. Like some of this isn't necessarily made that clear. And one of the things I want to do is kind of make that a bit more transparent, because the thing with astrology tends to be that there's a lot of different things that they're not as esoteric as they first seem. It's just a matter of encountering them, getting to grips with them enough, and also kind of bashing your head against the wall a little bit. And once you've done that a few times, it kind of just falls into place. I think, like magic, like scrying, especially, I think scrying is maybe less technical. Maybe there's not a ton of stuff going on, but in a sensory kind of perspective, like the ability to put oneself in a state that's kind of suitable to it, it's a little bit similar. I mean, it is divination, perhaps of a different nature in some ways, but certainly still divination. And there's kind of the same element here as well.
Yeah, definitely. Like, just to speak to the scrying component of it, it's just repetition, 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 doing everything over and over again and practicing diligently. Because that is the thing that will help, familiarize you with experiences, with phenomena, with sensory perception, and not to use the term in the conventional sense, but like literally extrasensory perception. Um, that's where what it all comes down to. And I think with astrology, you really succeed in um, actually making actionable the incredibly opaque technical vocabulary of the art by just kind of breaking down, in all of your writing and especially in this episode, just breaking down what things actually mean in context. So even as a non-astrologer, it's been really easy to follow along so far.
Well, I'm glad to hear, man. I'm glad to hear, honestly, because I think that's one of the things, right? Like you're saying, like repetition is really key. And when it comes to kind of learning astrology in particular, the best way to know what you don't know is to do it and be like, hey, I was a little bit I was a little bit in the dark here. I don't want that to happen again. I want to master this. Let's go find out what happens when this configuration is in place. Or, let's figure out how this technique works, because it's clear it's going to illustrate a lot in this situation. And that's how I grew as an astrologer. Like kind of encountering these issues and being like, shit, how do I navigate that? How do I look at that? How do I interpret this? And that kind of oh fuck feeling. It it's a nice driving force. And in general, like I mean, I haven't felt that in a while now, but it's definitely something that is important to our growth in any kind of divination, right? But yeah, I think as well, I want to make sure that our listeners get not just, the coverage here, but I also want to make sure we can give them some of the extra details. So this month's show notes, this episode's show notes, they're going to include a pretty carefully selected bibliography covering some of these topics, including some of the page numbers. For those that are interested in learning about the things we've mentioned but didn't really have the time to cover here today, I want to leave people in the dark. This is mostly introductory, some intermediate astrology. But I'm aware that not all of our listeners are practitioners of the celestial science themselves or have only dipped an ankle in the Lucia stars. So, we want to make further details available for everyone. Now, the final thing to touch on, really, it's when. When do you look at the condition of the planets in the chart? And the answer is always. You can't make an astrological judgment without knowing their activity and condition. The planets are instrumental. And all astrological prognostication requires them. But that was a cop-out answer. That was the obvious one. You all expected that, and I think I even said at the start of the episode. The real answer is, and this ties into proper delineation in general, during topical prognostication and judgment, not independently. You need to consider it, as we've said before, in the context of the subject that you're considering. Because as we said earlier, Mars might be good for one thing and fucking ruin other things. And we touched on that in discussing aspects. And this also applies for rulership as well. What if Mars is the ruler of the second house of wealth, but an aversion to it? How is that going to change his relationship with indications of wealth and assets and material resources? Maybe him being an aversion is actually going to save the net's finances. He does like to spend when money's involved. A lot of impulse-related motives there, but maybe it's also going to make them even worse somehow. Ultimately, the real summary of this episode is context, nuance, and relationships between stars, topics, and significators.
Well done, Salt. You freaking killed it.
No, thank you. This was a really fun one to write. It was written in about a day and a half, but yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you guys for being here as well.
Of course, our pleasure.
Always great when you lead us through an episode.
Yeah, and it's been a while, especially after quite a few different like guest features and some other ones. Yeah, I'm really, really happy that we got a chance to talk about something that you're really passionate about too. And am I correct in understanding that you actually have an Akashic record this time?
I do. I have two, not just one, two.
Whoa.
What? You never suggested it. People in our Q&As for the Patreons are always asking, like, Salt, drop your music taste.
I mean, the first one is kind of, it's a bit cheesy for they're both cheesy for an astrologist reference, but the first one is definitely like, just kind of on topic, not necessarily my casual listening taste, and that would be Gustav Holst's The Planets.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, I use it as ritual music sometimes, like just kind of to have in the background while preparing things.
You kind of have to, right? Like it's just, the closest we're going to get to modern day Orphic hymns. At least the instrumental side of it that Fashino was very keen on.
Mm-hmm.
But our second one, Avantasia, Stargazers, a bit of power metal just to brighten up the day.
Yes, power metal. Mine
yeah.
is mine is Age of Aquarius by Villagers of Ionina City.
A fantastic pick.
Thank you, thank you. Such a good album in general.
Mm-hmm. Anything ever put out by Villagers of Ionia City is perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And my Akashic record, continuing the theme of relying on Sleepytime Gorilla Museum for divination episodes, is Hymn to the Morning Star.
Listen, I was once driving early in the morning, having not slept the entire night to the airport with one of my spiritual mentors. And he put on Sleepy Time Gorilla Museum to wake us both up. And I just looked at him and I was like, this is not, emphasis is not on the sleepy time. Emphasis is on the gorilla.
So I haven't heard it, but this entire time I was imagining a gorilla performing dream incubation. Now I'm kind of disappointed that is probably not the case.
You know what? You can listen to this one yourself alongside everyone else because it will be on the Spotify Akashic Records of the Frightful Howls playlist. Link on the website with cunningcommand.com/podcast and all the usual places. And with that said, our list is set apart. I was gonna be like, listen, whatever is the actual planetary hour that we end off recording on is the one prayer from the Hygromantia that I will actually recite. And this time it's the prayer of the sun. Well, it doesn't be me. Like, do you want to do it, Key? Because you're usually our man.
Sure, I can take this one away. I
Oh
quite
hell
like the
yeah.
Prayer to the Sun from the Hygromantia.
Oh hell yeah. All right, let's do it.
King of kings and Lord of lords, supreme essence, eternal power, incomprehensible light, the only generous, the dispenser of mercy, look upon us with your grace and benevolence, so that we will be able to subdue this planet, the sun, and possess its virtues. I conjure you, untouched, unconquered sun, who shines at day by your annual cycle, by your wings, by your virtues, and in your following names: Glibioth, Anticon, Lethethiode, Aglapal, Elbako, Pipor, Nopliosem, Ugin, Gorasost, Totoraf, Ionan. In these names I conjure you, do not disobey me, but assist my present work by your grace.
Are you gonna say that on the show?
No,
Okay.
let's go. Yeah, let's not include that.